let's jump into this deep dive. We're going to be tackling the sermon today.
Okay.
It's all about, well, the nature of Jesus Christ.
Sounds pretty deep.
Yeah, we're going deep on this one. We're going right to the source, the Gospel of John.
Oh.
Specifically, verses 14 through 18.
Gotcha.
And, it's really about unpacking this core Christian belief that Jesus isn't just a man,
Right.
but God incarnate.
Okay, so we're talking about, the divinity of Christ.
Exactly. And this whole idea, it all hinges on that incredible statement, the Word became flesh.
Yeah, John doesn't mess around. He gets right to the heart of it. It's like he's saying, look, this is the foundation. This is what my entire gospel is built on.
Like, this is the main point, people.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Jesus is God in human form.
Boom. Mic drop.
And he's not just throwing out some theological concept for us to debate, This is about salvation.
Yeah, right from the start, it's clear. This isn't optional, this belief.
Right.
But, when John says the Word became flesh, what does that actually mean? Really mean?
Yeah.
I mean, God, the infinite, the eternal, actually becoming human.
It's mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it.
It is, right?
This sermon, it actually uses the term incarnation to describe it.
Incarnation.
Meaning, God didn't just kind of visit Earth in a human body.
Right.
He actually became one of us,
Sure.
fully human.
Wow.
The eternal Word, the second person of the Trinity, actually took on human nature, body, soul, spirit, the whole package.
So this wasn't just like God putting on a human costume for a bit.
No.
This is a deep, permanent union.
That's exactly it. A permanent union of God and man in the person of Jesus.
Okay, so the people who actually knew Jesus, his disciples, how do they wrap their heads around this?
Yeah.
How do they grasp that he was divine?
Well, the sermon points to these three key words that John keeps coming back to: glory, grace, and God.
Okay, so clues to the mystery of who Jesus is. All right, let's start with glory then.
Okay.
It's a word we use a lot, right?
Okay.
But it must have a way deeper meaning in this context.
Absolutely. To really get what John's saying, we've got to go back to the Old Testament.
Back to the OG.
Yeah, to that idea of God's glory.
Right.
So first you've got his intrinsic glory,
Intrinsic meaning.
built in, it's all his attributes, all wrapped up together.
Okay.
His love, power, holiness, wisdom, all those things that just make God, God.
So it's like the sum total of all his incredible qualities, right?
Exactly. And then you've got his manifest glory,
Manifest.
like how he shows his glory to us.
Got it. So visible signs.
Exactly, like that burning bush that Moses ran into, or the Shekinah glory that filled the tabernacle.
Oh, yeah, the visible light, right.
Right. A sign of God's presence, his power.
So are we saying that John and the other disciples, they experienced something similar with Jesus?
They did. The sermon points out they actually witnessed both types of glory with Jesus.
Both, wow.
The visible and the invisible.
So the transfiguration.
Exactly. Peter, James, and John, they saw Jesus radiating with light.
Yeah, that must have been intense.
Intense is an understatement. They were completely blown away.
But the sermon says that John, when he says, we beheld his glory, he wasn't just talking about that one event.
Nope. He was talking about Jesus's invisible glory, too.
The kind that's revealed in his character, his actions.
Right. They saw his love, his mercy, his wisdom, his power. It was always there, on display.
Day in and day out.
Every single day. It was more than just a flash of light, you know?
It was woven into who he was. Okay, so what about grace?
Okay, yeah.
That's a big one too.
Huge. So the sermon points out that Jesus is full of grace and truth.
Full of grace and truth. Grace,
meaning, God's undeserved favor.
God's love for us, even though we don't deserve it.
Exactly. But the sermon digs deeper, It says you can't truly experience this grace unless you accept the truth of the gospel.
The gospel being who Jesus is and what he did for us.
Yeah.
So, you can't separate grace and truth.
The two sides of the same coin.
And the sermon, it uses this really powerful image to describe grace.
What's that?
It calls it grace upon grace.
Grace upon grace. I like that.
It's like an endless waterfall of God's love.
That's beautiful.
It's not a one-time thing, it just keeps flowing. Okay, so that brings us to God.
Right.
That last word. What makes it stand out as evidence for Jesus' divinity?
This is where things get really interesting. The sermon brings up this verse, no one has seen God at any time.
Right.
But then how do we explain all those stories in the Old Testament about people encountering God?
That is a little confusing.
Yeah, right?
If no one has seen God,
Right.
Then how did all those people in the Old Testament?
Well, the sermon makes a distinction.
Okay.
God, in his pure essence, he's invisible.
Because he's pure spirit.
Right. So we can't fully comprehend him or perceive him directly.
Makes sense.
But then we have Jesus, who is, intimately connected to the Father. Right.
And he actually explains God to us.
So he's like a translator.
That's a great way to put it. The sermon uses this Greek word to describe this explaining, exogeomai, which literally means to interpret or give the meaning of something.
So Jesus is the ultimate interpreter of God.
That's the idea. He reveals God's character in a way that we can actually grasp.
So if you want to know what God's like,
you look at Jesus.
there's the perfect representation.
Exactly. And that leads to this really crucial point that the sermon makes.
Okay, what's that?
Believing in the wrong Jesus is just as bad as not believing in him at all.
What do you mean the wrong Jesus?
Like, you might believe that Jesus was a great teacher, a prophet even.
Okay, yeah.
But if you don't accept his full deity...
You're missing the whole point.
Exactly. If you don't believe he's a God in the flesh, then you've missed out on grace, on salvation.
It's like you're building your faith on shaky ground.
Exactly. It's not enough to accept just parts of who he is.
You have to accept the whole package. The sermon really drives this home. Your view of Jesus, it determines your whole relationship with God.
Okay, so we've talked about glory and grace as evidence for Jesus' divinity.
Right.
And how he uniquely reveals God to us. But what does it actually mean that the Word became flesh?
Yeah.
What are the implications of God becoming human?
Now we're getting to the really thought-provoking stuff. It's not just about Jesus putting on a human suit. It's a much deeper reality. And to really understand it, we need to look at the kind of humanity that Jesus took on. It really gets into the details here. It says that Jesus' humanity wasn't like Adam's, before the fall.
Oh,
it was post-fall humanity.
So subject to all the weaknesses, limitations, the stuff we deal with in a broken world.
Exactly.
So he wasn't some superhuman being just pretending to be like us.
No, not at all.
He actually experienced those limitations of being human.
Yeah.
What does the sermon say about that?
Well, it lists some pretty specific things like, hunger, thirst, fatigue.
Right. Basic human needs.
Yeah. And even death.
Wow. All consequences of the fall.
Exactly. And the point is, if Jesus hadn't taken on this fallen human nature, well, he wouldn't be able to relate to us.
To our struggles.
To our struggles. He wouldn't have genuine compassion,
Yeah, it's like you can't really understand someone's pain unless you've walked in their shoes.
Right.
But hold on a second. If Jesus was fully human,
Yeah.
doesn't that mean he was also capable of sinning?
Now, that is a really good question.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets even more, mind-blowing.
Okay.
The sermon emphasizes that Jesus was fully human, but also fully God.
Okay, so while he experienced those weaknesses,
He didn't sin.
didn't sin.
Not even once. It's this delicate balance,
Yeah.
But it's crucial to understanding who Jesus is.
Fully human. Experiencing everything we do, yet without sin. It's like walking a tightrope.
It is, and there's a reason for that, for his sinlessness.
What's that?
Well, if he had sinned even once, he wouldn't be qualified to be our Savior.
I see.
The sermon is crystal clear about this. Jesus was holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners.
Wow. Without sin forever.
Exactly. His sinlessness, that's what makes him the perfect sacrifice.
So it's his perfect humanity
Yeah.
combined with his divinity
Right.
that makes him able to bridge the gap between us and God.
That's it.
He gets our struggles
Yeah.
because he lived them,
Yeah.
yet he remains pure, sinless.
And that's what makes him the perfect sacrifice.
Wow. And the sermon doesn't just focus on theology, the big ideas.
Right.
It points out that Jesus actually dwelt among us for over 30 years.
He didn't just pop in for a quick visit.
No.
He immersed himself in our world.
He lived as one of us.
He got his hands dirty, so to speak.
And the sermon uses a very specific word to describe this, dwelling.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Skono,
Skono.
which literally means to pitch a tent.
Like, he set up camp right in the middle of our messed up world.
That's a powerful image, isn't it?
It is. It reminds me of something you said earlier about how John, even after seeing all this evidence, all the miracles,
Right.
he still referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Yeah. It wasn't just about the power or the glory. It was that personal love that really resonated with John.
Yeah, even in the face of all that, what stuck with him was love.
It's really at the heart of what makes Jesus so compelling. It's not just about cosmic power or theology.
It's personal.
It's personal. It's his love for us. And that love, it changes us.
Yeah, it meets us where we are.
Right where we are.
In all our brokenness.
All our mess. And offers us hope.
Redemption.
No, not condemnation.
Exactly. It's about healing, restoration.
So that brings us back to that question the sermon posed.
Oh, yeah.
If Jesus truly explains God, what does that tell us about God? What might surprise us?
What might challenge us? Yeah, that's a big one.
What comes to mind for you?
Well, for me, the big takeaway is it paints a picture of a God who is deeply personal.
Relational. A God who isn't afraid to come close, to get involved, to experience our pain.
That's powerful.
It suggests that vulnerability isn't a weakness.
It's a strength.
It challenges our typical image of God.
The distant, unapproachable God.
Right. It suggests that maybe God is more like us than we realize.
And maybe we're more like God than we realize.
That's the mystery of the incarnation.
This idea of God becoming one of us.
It changes everything.
How so?
Yeah.
What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, I think, for one thing, it changes how we see ourselves.
Okay.
If God's not afraid to become human, to really embrace those limitations, vulnerabilities, maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss our own humanity.
I can see that. It gives us permission to embrace who we are.
The whole package.
Yeah, messy bits and all. But it's not just about self-acceptance, right?
No, it's bigger than that.
This also changes how we see God.
It totally reframes our understanding.
Like it shatters that old image of a distant, unfeeling God.
The cosmic dictator sitting on a throne.
Right. It suggests that maybe God's more like a loving parent, deeply involved in our lives.
Choosing to experience life alongside us.
Sharing in our joys.
And our sorrows.
Which, if you really think about it, it changes how we approach our relationship with God.
For sure.
If he's not some distant being we have to appease.
Right.
But a loving presence who wants intimacy with us.
It transforms everything.
It does. Prayer becomes less about formulas.
More about honest conversation.
Worship becomes less of a duty.
And more of an expression of love, gratitude.
Faith.
Yeah.
It's less about following rules.
It's about embracing a living relationship.
Yeah. Like the whole playing field shifts,
It does.
Suddenly faith feels less about performance.
And more about connection.
But I keep coming back to this idea of grace.
Grace.
If God's really like this, so loving and present.
How does that affect grace?
Yeah.
That's where that phrase, grace upon grace, it becomes really powerful.
Okay.
It's not just that God offers us forgiveness, mercy.
Right.
It's that he does it so freely,
Abundantly.
lavishly, without holding back.
Like he's constantly pouring out his love.
No matter what.
No matter how many times we mess up.
It's true.
And that's only possible because of who Jesus is.
Right.
Because he bridged that gap.
Between us and God.
He made this kind of radical grace possible.
Exactly. And, the sermon makes this point that grace, it's not just some theological idea.
Right.
It changes how we live.
How so?
Well, it empowers us to love others the same way.
Unconditionally.
Unconditionally.
Oh.
To forgive freely. To show compassion even when it's hard.
Even to those who don't deserve it.
Exactly. It's like the love and grace we receive.
Yeah.
It overflows into our relationship.
It changes how we see the world.
How we treat each other.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
It really is. And the sermon reminds us, this understanding of God.
Yeah.
As loving, vulnerable, full of grace. It shouldn't just stay in our heads.
It's got to go deeper.
Into our hearts, our actions.
It should change how we live.
Absolutely.
So as you reflect on this deep dive into the deity of Christ,
think about what it means for you.
Personally.
What surprised you? Challenged you?
What are the implications for your own life?
Your relationships.
Maybe it'll even inspire you to see things in a whole new light.
The world.
Yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.